Hello everyone, welcome to Winning the Away Game. If you love business and the Springbok rugby, this show is for you. I am Justinus Adriaanse, co-founder of Private Property and We Think Code in South Africa and Entebeni Systems and Mgundi Holdings in Canada. I love three things in life: Nando's, the Bulls, and Springboks. My co-host Flip van der Merwe is also a Blue Bulls legend, Springbok number 818 with 38 caps at lock. He took the leap to go to France in and into a second career in data, consulting and strategy consulting. These days, he's managing partner of Level 6 Consulting, helping post-growth service companies get ahead and out of the scrum and find the gap. Flip, how are you today?
Justinus, great to be here.
So let's get our guests going. Flip, who did you bring for us today?
Yeah, Justinus, my guest needs no introduction to Boks supporters and South Africa in general. He is a giant in the second row, a 1995 World Cup winner, and a man who knows what it means to shoulder a nation's hopes and shoulder the weight of life after rugby. Since hanging up the boots, he's built, backed and fronted businesses. He's mentored, broadcast and kept the flame of South Africans gees wherever he goes. He's a local hero. He's globally respected. His hands are equally nimble on a piano as it is on a Welshman's chin. Cobus Wiese.
Wow, awesome. My guest away game spans continents and industries. He started far away from wine with a bit of medicine, modeling, and then seizing South Africa's re-entry into the world in the 90s, bringing South African wines to America. He co-founded Cape Classics in New York in the early 1990s and helped put names like Kononkorp and Rustenburg on US shelves, and later turned his energy to early childhood education to the Indaba Foundation. He's equal part entrepreneur, storytelling, and bridge builder between South Africa and the world. Welcome, Andre Scherer.
Thank you, Justinus.
Welcome. So let's kick off with the first question. We would love to hear your favorite Springbok story. Andre, we'll hear yours first and give Cobus a chance to go through his library. So, Andre, please tell us your favorite Springbok story.
My story is that the Springboks have absolutely kept me connected to home. We've watched as many of the World Cups as we can. And I think it's just added to the power of the brand of who we are, where, frankly, government and other organizations have failed to build the brand. The Springboks have actually built our brand almost better than any other entity in the country. So that's my Springbok story, is just how proudly South Africa it's made us feel over the decades.
Wow, awesome. It's actually amazing. A lot of South Africans abroad that I speak to almost become bigger Springbok supporters once they leave the country than they ever were in South Africa. So Cobus, all yours.
Yeah, I think there's so many, and as Flip will tell you, that it's personal and that you witnessed and been involved in, not involved in. But I think a fitting one today would be about Flip's dad, which I was very happy to play with as a student. He was one of my lecturers at Potchefstroom at Varsity, and we also played together for the college and played for Western Transvaal. And that stage, he was a Springbok already, and I was just a snot-nosed kid who wants to become one. And this story was told to me by the legendary Jan Boland Coetzee, one of the hard men of South African rugby, and an absolute gentleman who passed away sadly a week or two ago. And so Flip's dad told us this one day. He says he made his debut, believe it or not, as an 18-year-old snot-nose for Marties and Western Province, which was remarkable to make your debut as an 18-year-old in a team absolutely laid with stars. Morne du Plessis, Boland Coetzee, Robbie Blair, Achie Koch, Chris Pope, all these legends. It was virtually a Springbok side, the Western Province side, and in came this Northern Cape 18-year-old tight-head prop forward, Flippy van der Merwe. And he said he was so nervous, although, I mean, Flip was a big man. He's still a big man. I mean, 6'4", 135 kilos, that's huge, even for a tight head. Which was nice for a lock to scrum behind, because I didn't do all the work as the locks normally do. So the tight head actually did his own work. So he says the first game he was nervous, and they hit in the scrum, and Boland Coetzee was on the side, and as they hit the scrum, they went forward. He thought, geez, the power's coming through. It's wonderful. I mean, he's settled. His debut is going to be a dream debut. The second scrum, even better. The third scrum, even more power. And as they ran towards the line out after the fourth scrum, he heard this voice beside him, and he said to him, "Luister, Lighty, I've done my bit now. You got to scrum now on your own. That was Boland Coetzee. And I said to him, what did you say? He says, yeah, oom, no problem.
Awesome. That's amazing.
Actually, Justinus, if I can add a very funny anecdote that Cobus has reminded me of, it's Jan Boland Coetzee related, actually, and it's a combination of his wine background. And as you said, Cobus, we lost a real legend just the other day. And I'll never forget, in the early 90s, it's just started the business, tough as nails. We managed to get, I'm sure you guys have heard of the Wine Spectator. It's a very famous US publication. And we had the very first US journalist from the Wine Spectator was visiting South Africa. So one of the people we decided to take him to visit was Jan Boland Coetzee. And James Suckling, a seasoned New Yorker, had arrived with a little suitcase of velvet with his glasses in it. Yeah, you know what's coming. And we arrived at Jan's place, and he disappeared, and he brought out some unlabeled wine bottles. They were nonetheless spectacular. But as we're sitting tasting, he watched with curiosity as James took these glasses out of his little box, and he sat them down. And James started to say, when you make wine, he used those few words to start. And Jan Boland looked at him and said, listen here. He said, F all about making wine. I believe you write about wine, so why don't we stick to the writing part? My brother and I thought we had just lost the Wine Spectator for good. We were like, oh my God. Anyway, James sat there for a moment because he was hallowed territory. And he then obediently continued with his interview and the chatting and the tasting. And he got in the car and he said, geez, guys, you know what? That guy doesn't care who the hell I am. We said, no, Jan does not care who you are. So it was he was endeared by South Africa, and that meeting never left his mind. That journalist, I promise you, he spoke about it for many years. Yeah.
Excellent. Cobus, you touched a little bit on the Onderwys College there in Potchefstroom, and I wanted to bring it up later that our paths actually crossed. I couldn't remember it, but I knew you were in Potchefstroom at about the same time. I was born in Potch, and there's many of a rugby legend went through the hands of Potchefstroom and Western Transvaal and the Pikke, as it was called. Growing up in Paarl and then moving on to Western Transvaal. When was the first time you realized that you could actually make it as a rugby player? Maybe not a professional at first, but make it big, yeah.
Geez, that's a good question. I suppose, like all of us, we grow up, we get our brains and our genes, and we all grow up wanting to play for South Africa. I remember I was at a function last night, and I was prompted a similar question. I said, I grew up in Namibia, in the Namib Desert, and when the Boks were touring your dad, 81, where they were touring down in New Zealand, my dad woke us up at 3 a.m. to lie on the carpet listening to the radio. We didn't have a TV. I mean, we got a TV only years later. So you listen to the legendary Gerard Vivier doing commentary with the Springboks, the mighty Boks touring New Zealand, playing against the men from the land of the long white cloud, and this incredible rivalry. It is a rivalry between us and England. It's a rivalry between us and France and Australia, but it's very different, us and New Zealand. It always will be, and there's no disrespect against any of the other countries, because they are like us. We hate losing. We want to do the best we can. We believe we are the best, and that's why some of my best mates, Flip, I'm sure you'll say the same, is the guys that you played against. But there's massive rivalry, but massive respect. And to this day, I'm good mates with Zinnie and with Fitzy and Andrew Mertens and Robin Brook and these guys, which we fought hard battles, but have massive respect for each other. But when you start playing, I actually, they always say any respectable member of the Tide Five is actually just a fly in a forward's body. We all think we've got major skills, the Tide forwards. But I started on the wing for the Helena Marine Primary School in Luderitz, and I ran 100-meter sprint for my school, and then I discovered my mum's good cooking and stuff like that, and I went to a hostel, and then you eat anything you get your hands on to survive, let alone picky, and you all know hostel food is absolutely disastrous. But then I moved to the lock, like Flip started growing, and I think, I loved playing lock. I think it's And I'm not being biased or sarcastic. I think even the great Dr. Donnie Craven said, give me 2 good locks and I'll build the rest of the team for you. If you think about it, without being biased, the locks really are the heart, the guts, the fire, the power and the scrums, the line-out providers, the kickoff controllers, the guys that get things going. That's maybe why I love playing in the lock position. But even as a youngster, I listened to those guys, and I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be. It just seems so mysterious. And without winding on, the very first live game, 2 live games I saw was playing for the Northwestern Cape under 11 side against the Griquas under 11 side in Uppington, a curtain raiser for the mighty All Blacks of Brian Law and Billy Bush and Grant Batty and Sid Going. And Northwestern Cape had this legendary captain who played till he was about 100, Herklaas Engelbrecht. And he was, nobody cared about the mayor of Uppington because Herklaas was the mayor, besides being the captain of Northwestern Cape. He was everything, but an unbelievable gentleman. And I sat there, and it seemed to me there was about 100,000 people, probably only 5,000, and they got the hiding of their life. But it's irrelevant because in the final minute of the game, there was a penalty awarded on the halfway line, and Northwestern Cape was trailing with about 50 points. And silence fell over the crowd, and Herklaas walked forward and he said to the ref, "I'm going for posts." Silence fell over the crowd. He put the ball down. He hit that thing. It's still flying through the sticks. They carry him off shoulder height from the field. I said to my mum, "This is ridiculous. If you get treated like a hero when you lose with 50, what happens when you win with 50?" And that's when the Gogga bit me. And I thought, this is the kind of game that I would love to. It was amazing for me that 15 men with different sizes and skills and backgrounds can try and outwit each other, outmuscle each other, outplay each other, with a piece of leather, and how they do it, and how the crowd and the people gets caught up in this. To me, that was just amazing.
Wow. Awesome. So, Andre, you started nowhere near wine as a model in Europe when this opportunity in the 90s opened up. Give us just a short story around starting the business and being in New York and pulling this all together.
Yeah. So my days of medical school were sort of formative because it made me realize that it wasn't what I wanted to do, but I also had no idea what I did want to do. And just sanctions when I moved to Europe, and I started modeling in Johannesburg, basically to start paying my varsity bills. And it was early days in the game, so there were not that many male models in the business, and I used to do catalog work. But it was, at the time, I was obviously very grateful because it was an amazing opportunity going country to country, just working in a sector where you have a lot of free time. You're traveling as far as your passport will allow. But it was during that time as well that I politically started to question and answer a whole lot of things about South Africa. And so when I started engaging politically, there was an organization called the South Africa Foundation back in the day, and they had quite a few organizational structures across Europe. And it was in that time that I started meeting business people while I was modeling. And it was a fateful day with a guy who joined me and said, "Look, I've got some German businessmen are interested in the wine industry, and as sanctions in Europe are being lifted, would you consider?" Now, I was a teetotaling vegetarian, so how's that for a wine merchant start? I mean, it couldn't get as far away if you tried it. But I said to him, absolutely, and I called my brother Gary, who I knew as a wine drinker, and he actually contacted our middle brother, who is a doctor. He said, "Actually, I have a Cape Wine Master friend." So when I came back home, we did a few visits, and in those days, in 1991, there was no exports of wine. 1990, and so we actually started visiting through this Cape Wine Master friend. We went to see the first property was Telima. Telima was brand new. Giles's first vintage was 89. And so we ended up meeting people, Mulderbosch, Larry Dobrovic, and Mike Dobrovic, and Larry Jacobs was his name. These guys were cutting edge, and we had no idea, but we tasted some of them as recommendations, and they were spectacular. So my first wine literally was at Giles's cellar, tasting his 89 cab. And I'll never forget the moment where I stuck my nose in a glass, and there was something about that aroma and something about that particular taste even. And I just remembered walking out of that cellar thinking, wow, that just blew my mind. And then he said to us, have you guys heard of Mulderbosch? And we said, no. And he said, well, go and visit them. It's just over the hill. So we drove. And the guys were like so excited. Nobody was selling anything abroad. So we pieced together this collection of absolutely amazing wines. I had bugger all idea about what wine was. I had no clue. But I went back to Germany now, this wine merchant, and the gentleman in question said, no, these guys have decided to not do wine yet. So it's like, my hand's now full of wine. I'm like, oh, well, now what? So I just, as a SMOS will do, I decided to find some local agents and started traveling through the embassy in Bonn. I started making contacts with various people. And we established a relationship with a German importer who was actually fascinated by the whole topic. And so we started shipping to Germany in 91. But in the July of 91, as this was unfolding, I had met an extraordinary woman. Her name is Ange, and she lived between New York and Europe. And like me, had been a model, South African. Long story short, she was booked on a trip to Vegas. And the producer said, listen, Andre, would you like to join? And you can do some of the, the male stuff. So, of course, I did. And it was in Vegas that we watched George Bush announce the lifting of sanctions against the United States. So this idiot who has got no idea commercially says, you know what, we must host a tasting in America. Now, I don't know where to start. So the first thing I do is I phone from the hotel in Vegas. I phone the New York Consulate General, who've been living behind bulletproof glass and sanctions and are sort of have no commercial connectivity to the world. And some Yahoo out of the blue phones to say that he wants to host a wine tasting. So they were like, oh my word, like, yes, whatever you need, like whatever you want. So anyway, pieced this wine tasting together. They helped us fly wines to New York. And we hosted a tasting. I would say it was the motley crew, but I'd never hosted a wine tasting. My brother Gary definitely was a lot more erudite than I was. But my wife was one of the most beautiful women in New York and was dressed accordingly. So she was the star of the show, where she hosted the evening with us. And so we actually tasted a bunch of people who turned out to be quite influential. And one of them invited us the very next day to an event in Philadelphia, which was the Society of Wine Educators. And I met a couple of the New York Times journalists, and I met a whole bunch of people who were fascinated by the category. And that just kind of snowballed. And eventually we set up shop in the United States. I had never the intention, and I think that was my point about moving abroad. There was never a sense or plan. It was just as things unfolded and as they happened, I just went with the flow. And there was never a sense, oh, I'll do this for 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. And the next second was 5 years and then 10 years. And, we lost money for almost a decade. And I think my brother and the shareholders were like, what the hell are you doing? I was like, we're going to have to stick this one out, boys, because we're going to have to figure this out and stay the course if you want to make a dent.
Wow.
So Cobus, you had an incredible rugby career, and we all know about the glory of 95. Actually, not so sure when it actually officially ended. How did you come to the day to say, well, this is enough, I'm done, hanging up my boots, going into the business world?
Again, interesting question, which I also have asked other guys in our game or other sports gave up. I actually didn't know. And I'll explain to you why. I was doing a function down in P with Dave Richardson, the Protea wicketkeeper, and Dave just retired, but he was playing the best cricket of his career. So I said, Davey, how did you know? He said, I didn't know. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I was in the nets. I was hitting a ball. It was as big as a watermelon, in the sweet spot. I was feeling great mentally, physically. I was doing the best in my career. I got up the next morning. I said to my wife, that's me, overnight. And he walked away. I said, are you any regrets? He says, none at all. It was exactly the same with me. I was playing the best rugby of my career. I could have played at least 3 or 4 more years, I believe. But I think I've been unbelievably blessed. It's a privilege. I saw it as a privilege. The guys that I played with, played against, I have absolutely no regrets whatsoever. I met my wife and we started this new business, and it was just the right time, Flip, to do that transition without contemplating, without thinking, well, is it the right? I just made a decision. The next day I was carrying on in a new life, and looking back, thank God for that and thank God for my wife, which is an unbelievable girl. She sees the heart of this business. She makes me a better person. And no, boys, she's not here that I'm trying to impress her. I mean, she's just. I had this dream to always work for myself. Somewhere in the food trade. I mean, when I was a student, I played in France and stayed in the north, and then in Carcassonne, that area, and I was in Italy and stayed. And Flip, as you very well know, then you got a bit of time on your hands. You walk around, you look at things, and the food bug, not particularly coffee, but the food bug was always part of my life. My mum, I spent a lot of time with my mum. We were exceptionally close, and my mum was best cook and baker I've ever met in my life, and I helped her. And I cooked these days. I cook at home 7 days a week. I have a love for it, but I think it's also connected my love for people. And there's nothing nicer to have friends around a table with top red wine, top food, and company. That's the ultimate. That's how you build bridges. That's how you spend great time. I think that my love for all those things pushed me into this game of the coffee business and food. So, yeah, it was overnight. It wasn't sitting around for 2 years waiting what I'm going to do with my life after rugby. And that, thank God for that. It's not the same for everybody, though. We all know that.
If you had to do it again, would you do it the same thing, or would you change something else?
No, I'll do exactly the same. Exactly the same. I would, on that question. It's again great question, because we did this program, Talks van Linde, myself, called Oor die Kolle, where we interviewed 135 people of different levels. And we not only sportsmen. I mean, from Raymond Ackerman, Gary Player, Debbie Bingham. You guys will remember Debbie Bingham, the brilliant gymnast. All those kind of things. Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran. We went to upstate New York. Stan Christodoulou was so kind to introduce us at the Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota in the States, which is a small little town where there's probably not only 5,000 people, but the International Boxing Hall of Fame is there. And for a week, once a year, they induct people, and then there's like 30,000 people crowding this little town, and all the legends of boxing was there. So we did interview with those guys, the great Buster Douglas, Marvin Hagler, these boys. And funny enough, guys, I always ended all those interviews, 135 of them, with the same question: if we can turn the clock back, would you do it again? Do you know, strangely enough, that 134 of them, of the 135, without blinking an eye, said absolutely, change nothing. Only one person said no, she wouldn't do that again, and that would be Debbie Bingham, the gymnast. And I was like, thrown. I thought, really? Are you sure? Do you want to answer it again? Because we were so used to everybody saying, no, absolutely not. And it haunts me to this day what she said. She said, the simple reason is because I didn't know what it was like to be a child. And then it got me thinking, because if you guys, when is a gymnast at their best? From the age of 4 till about 13. That's their peak. And in that time, they train like 10 hours a day, which made a lot of sense. But in general, 99%, they all said, absolutely change nothing.
Wow. Awesome. So Andre, about your business, what's fascinating to me about the business that you had to start is you almost like a two-sided marketplace, because at the same time you had to convince the farmers in the Cape to allow you to export their wines to the US, and you had to educate the public in the and the distributors and the retailers in the US about South African wine. So that must have been a challenge. So if you look back at now and what you learned, what was the biggest challenges there, and how would you do it differently if you could go back and do it over?
Sure, interesting question. So I think what I found comes back to, I think, what both Cobus and Flip have said, and you and I have talked about this, Justinus. It's about people, and it's about relationships, and it's about trust. So a lot of producers had this issue. We were new. They didn't know who we were and what we were able to do. But I think the key was the first years were really a trust-building period where people actually realized that we were serious, that it was a brand new market, so it was extremely difficult. What's important to realize, though, that is the South African mindset became a curiosity to me, that South Africans at the top of their game in the wine trade almost, they want to know that you are worthy of carrying them. In the States, on the other hand, generally, the supplier wants to prove their worthiness to the client, the buyer. So that has been an interface of complexity, because I say to South Africans, listen, you've got to listen to your market. You've got to listen to what your customers are telling you. When you think that you're so good that you now pick and choose and you're not sure that you will or won't, or you must take this, I'm like, that's not quite how the commercial world works. Then on the flip side, to your very good point, I spent many years, describing geography as a central point of what I was. I have never been a businessman first. I've been a South African first in everything that I've done. But I realized that the South Africanness was what made the wine industry so particular. But we came, obviously, on the back of Mandela. I remembered at the Waldorf Hotel, my wife and I were invited in the 94 National Foreign Trade Council hosting, where they hosted Mandela as they do heads of state. And it was my very first glimpse at why the image of South Africa was going to be a lot more difficult for us to manage. The South Africans came, they were celebrated, or Mandela was remarkable that evening. He stayed until the bitter end, and everybody thought he'd leave early. The Waldorf was packed with all the top folks in the world who'd all flown in for this first public appearance of his abroad. And there was no follow-up. The government literally got in the plane and went home. And the National Foreign Trade Council said, well, where are all the business delegations? Where are all the connections being made? And it was my first, and sadly has remained the benchmark, that we haven't really taken the time to understand that the marketing of our nation's ethos and our branding is vitally important to the consumer. The Americans didn't really know or care who we were. Sanctions were a big deal. They wanted us to do better as being humans, but where did we live in the world, and what were we, and who? They didn't understand who we were. So I used to end up explaining to people over and over again, and people say, well, which country in South Africa? I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard that over and over again. Or, yeah, how's life in Argentina? I'm like, no, it's South Africa. They're like, oh, yeah, of course. Well, how's Australia? I'm like, no, it's South Africa. I mean, over and over again. So what we've really had to do, and this was in the early years, and we deal with the same issue now, we have zero collected brand image. Zero. We have an inability with a country like this, with a people like this, with the magnitude of the sport, with the Springboks, with the fruit, the wine, the beauty of the countryside. I mean, you name it, the game. We are unable to tell the story, because originally we thought the world should know our story. We think people must understand who we are. And I'm like, no, get in line, my friend. So it was an interesting stepping stone for the guys back at home to realize that where they were in the States was nothing. Nobody knew who they were. So we've had to build it on the passion of who we are. The juices had to be excellent. But the producers have been our best assets. I always say to people, we in the wine industry have lost our way. We made wine too complicated, and now we're losing ground to these spritzers and drinks and cannabis-infused drinks. The wine industry is about people. It's about soil. It's about family. It's about friendships. It's as Koop has described. How many moments beat a table or a braai or a gathering where you open a bottle together? You don't generally open a vodka bottle and share it. You have a vodka. But a wine bottle you open, and it's like a food. And you then taste the soils and the benefits and the extraction of decades of people's efforts and energy and a country's passion.
Yeah, that's extremely well put, Andre. And thank you for that perception. I think as Kobus can attest, if you go to the fortified city of Carcassonne, people will actually open up a bottle of Pastis 51, and they will actually share a table around that. So it pretty much depends on the culture, but I cannot agree with you more. And it's a bit of a shame that we do not sit around a good old wooden table and have this conversation with a good cooked meal and a good bottle of wine. Kobus, you similarly, you entered a highly competitive market when you started out. Coffee and the food industry, it's one of the things that actually worked in South Africa already when you started. I can't recall how popular well-made coffee was already. You know, I was brought up on Ricoffee, so I can't say that much. What gave you the inkling to actually import original coffee beans, roast it yourself, sell it at premium? Was there a market, or was it something that you started from the scratch?
Actually, my wife hates when I tell the story, but it's the truth. I've never been a guy that went on blind dates. I didn't believe in blind dates. And then a bosom buddy of mine since school, Barley Swart, actually introduced my wife to me as a blind date. And, that was the first and last blind date of my life, which I married, which is a good thing. So it was about a flip on our second date in the East Rand Mall in Boksburg. We went out for a movie and afterwards looking for a coffee shop, walking around, and tucked away in a corner was this really minute little coffee shop with nobody in but the two of us and the guy sitting behind the counter listening to a radio. So we ordered coffee, and I said to her, "This is brilliant coffee. It's strange that there's nobody here." But then looked around, and without being overcritical, the menu was really crappy little menu. There was a couple of sandwiches and wasn't really servicing. And I got this crazy idea, as the Type 5 normally gets, and I said to this geezer, "Is this your store, uncle?" He says to me, No, it's my two sons. They're dentists in Boksburg. I'm just looking after the store. And I said, "Don't you want to sell?" Not having money. He says, "Well, it's not really in the market, but give me your number and we'll come back to you." A year later, I got this call. He says to me, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Are you still interested?" I said, "Yes. What do you want?" I'll never. And I'm sure Andre and you guys were all. There's certain numbers and dates and things in your life which is burned on the inside of your skull for whatever reason. This is one of them. He said 485,000. I said, "Yes." I didn't have 100,000. Anyway, so I said to the two of us, she just finished her studies at the PUC, and I said to her, are you in with me? She says, "Let's give it a go." And my folks and her folks all said, "Your folks are on tick. You're smoking dope. You've got no experience in the restaurant trade, no training about coffee, nothing. But I've always had this burning desire to work for myself. I wasn't made to sit behind a desk 24/7 and not talk to people and not go around and try and make deals. It's just I enjoy that. I love people. I love communicating with people. My wife said I'm the only oak still going into the bank to draw money because I talk crap to the tunnies behind the counter. But somebody has to. You understand? So I love doing that, and that's how we were introduced. I mean, we borrowed and begged, and I promise you guys. Gave the oak a check, and he said to me at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, "Here's the keys. Good luck for tomorrow." That's how we started the book. The next day we opened. If I tell you there was chaos, it's an understatement. I didn't know what a muffin should look like. What do I sell it with? Where do I get it? And so forth. But it was chaos for the first month. But one thing we had was each other, the belief in each other, the trust and the willingness to roll up our sleeves and work. And willing to learn. Another big thing, and I'm sure Andre will agree with me, he knew nothing of the wine trade, and we knew nothing, and we still know nothing about the coffee trade, but we were willing to learn and not make the same mistake twice. We also believe in our franchise in the stores that even if you're the owner of the store, and that's what my dad taught me, you must be willing and able to do anything in that store better than anybody working for you. It's credible. It shows respect. And when the pauper eats the fan, I can do anything better than anybody there. And we live by that. A franchisee once says to me, "Yeah, but I'm the owner of 3 stores. Why do I have to mop the floors and grill and be a barista?" And I said, "Why not? What makes you better? Because you had the money to buy or whatever. Because your staff will respect you far more if they know you know. They know you know and can do it better. And it's credible, guys, and so forth. And I'm learning every day still. But that's how we got into this game. And I realized that good coffee is as you guys know, it's the second hardest trading commodity in the world after oil. And that's why it's called black gold. And it's growing by the days. And no disrespect, but the Chinese population in general, only about 7% of them drink coffee. The rest still tea, and hopefully they don't come over to coffee because we won't have enough coffee in the world to supply everybody. And it's growing with leaps and bounds, and the forms of coffee and so forth. And like wine, and I'm a huge red wine lover. I'm a staunch red wine drinker, but the coffee as well. It is an incredible product. And the quality of the beans, I quickly realized that I was roasting my own beans in the store and people started buying. And I quickly realized people are willing to pay for a product. Like Jannie Engelbrecht, the legendary Jannie Engelbrecht of Rust and Vrede used to say with his gebrei, he used to say always on tour, "Guys, good red wine at any price is still a bargain." And I believe in that. You can taste quality of good red wine. You can taste quality of coffee if it's proper Arabica beans and roasted properly in the process in the water softener of your espresso machine and your barista skills. Those are all things like the winemaker, like the soil, like the terroir, like the oak he uses or not, and the hand of God and nature. All those things make an unbelievable bottle of wine. So's coffee. As with wine, you can have the same coffee from Brazil, from the same region, that might taste slightly different every year because of the terroir and the soil and the weather conditions of these things. And I think that makes it extremely interesting and popular. And just to prove that point, cappuccino is the most popular hot drink in the world by far. So if you make a proper cappuccino with quality beans, quality barista, water quality, and those things, and I've done that survey in our stores, if you're a coffee lover and you sit down, you drink at least 2.2 cups at a sitting, guaranteed.
That's amazing, Cobus. And I mean, taking over the keys at 5 o'clock and needing to run the shop the next day must have been fascinating.
I think it's Justina, I think it's a tight 5 thing. You know, we don't think about things; we just flip and do it. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. It's just, you know, you can always say later, well, maybe it wasn't the right call, but you're in it now, so.
Yeah. You have to. You've burnt the ships. There's only one way to go, and that's forward.
And that's forward. That's forward.
So maybe, Cobus, can you share with us what would you say was in your business journey was for you the lowest point? When was the time when you felt the deepest in the gutter, needing to fight your way out of it?
Next morning, we opened that store. That check was cashed already, so it's over Skadova. There was no turning back. No, I wouldn't say there were points that you were thinking, yes, this was the gravest mistake of your life, because that's what I wanted to do. I mean, we just had to learn, and every day and every week after that, as you learn and start understanding, it became better. Not easier, better, because it's a tough trade. Restaurant trade is the toughest trade in the world, in my opinion. You work with a variety of people from all walks of life, and every oak is a coffee connoisseur, and he wants to tell you he's got, no disrespect, he's got coffee at home, but when he comes to your store, he wants to tell you how to make a cappuccino, and so forth and so forth. So, and I say that with tongue in cheek. I think the low point and points, and it's a continuous thing and it's a general thing in life, is to find trustworthy people in general. People by nature, unfortunately, is not trustworthy, is not reliable. And when you're an entrepreneur, and I'm not thinking I'm an entrepreneur, it's a fancy word, and I don't deserve to be called that. I'm just somebody who wants to work for myself, and I think my wife's more the entrepreneur. But I think the fact it comes with lots of pressure, and Andre will definitely tell you guys this, and you guys as well, is that when the other oaks sleep at night, then you lie awake to think, how the hell am I going to pay all these bills? How the hell am I going to pay the rent at the end of the month? How am I going to get coffee in time? These kind of things. But that's fine. That's the choice you make. That's the responsibility for entrepreneur. But our continent, our country, desperately need entrepreneurs, because what does an entrepreneur do? They care about one thing only, is to grow, and by doing that automatically creates more jobs and more jobs and more jobs, and empower people. Governments don't do that. They don't care, and I'm happy to tell them in their faces they're wasting our time. We need to have more entrepreneurs and empower more entrepreneurs, guys, because most I know, and without sounding soppy and just carrying on and on, it makes me feel unbelievably blessed and fortunate, and makes me happy when a new store opens. I know there's 30 families getting fed, and I love that. I absolutely love that.
Amazing. And you, Andre, what was the low point for you in the 35-year journey of building this business?
I think in micro dosage there were so many, because you realize the enormity of the challenge. We just didn't have any access to anybody else. We never had lawyers, accountants, doctors, family members to call upon. You have zero people in your network. You literally are working from 6 a.m. till midnight, 7 days a week for years, literally. The only reason my wife would leave her little office and meet me at mine was because our office closed at 11 p.m. on Madison Avenue. And she would fetch me in the cab at 11 o'clock. I'd stand outside with the garbage trucks, and we'd then take the cab to our apartment and have a pizza at midnight and fall into bed, and you were up at 6 o'clock back at the same thing. So, the downs are not that the downs are almost the exasperation waiting for people to recognize this amazing thing that you've got. And you end up realizing that you're nowhere in the line. I think in the context, as Kobus says, I really respect the food and beverage game. I know the food industry, the restaurant sector is very challenging. It's usually an all-night affair. You are very challenged with family time because you're working after hours. In our sector, it was simply trying to bring people's awareness to a product that we knew was world-class, but your frustration levels became depleted because you simply just couldn't get enough people interested to make the viability something until you reach that tipping point where finally you actually make ends meet on convincing people. And then the battle is almost always around finance. When you have no banking backbone, you don't have assets to deal back on, you've really got to make something out of nothing. And that's where relationships become fundamental. I, to this day, have a banking partner, a South African man from Sea Point that I met 34 years ago, who is now the chairman of this organization in New York. That relationship has stood us through thick and thin. I want to tell you, way past what banking metrics would permit. The relationship I built with him was so phenomenal. And there was such a level of trust that he would simply over the years say, you know what, yeah, whatever, we'll give you the $300,000 or whatever for 3 months. So, you come back down to something that Kobus said, people's trust, people's capacity, the ability of people. I think that is one of the really big challenges in the world today. And I have to say, South Africa's greatest challenge is the lack of human resourcing. We have got a failed education system. We've got a failed work ethic, and that is at every level. I have friends who are in the headhunting game, and they will tell you from CEO to coffee maker, there's a problem. The ethic, the work readiness, the capacity, the ability for somebody to simply do the most basic task properly is challenged. And that is why, and we'll get to that in the next hour, but that's why my focus on early years education is the most important thing I've ever done in my life, because we're resourcing the base of the human development pyramid. And unless we do that properly, I'll give you an example. We have staff at a garden, and we get upset because somebody can't clip the hose pipe together. You know what? Inevitably, that person never had puzzles growing up. They never had things that were allowing them to build fine motor skills. They just didn't have it. So, by the way, you can say, don't be such a bloody idiot. Well, guess what? They don't have that wiring neurologically. It just didn't happen at the same place at the same time. So we judge people on sometimes irrefutable actions in life that have prevented you from developmentally having that opportunity. And you can say it's stupidity. It's not. It's life circumstance. All of those things are preventable and avoidable. But I think, Justinus, the downs have been almost the loneliness where you, in the beginning, and you're offshore. My wife, without her, the business would never exist, because she was that backbone that we didn't have as a couple or as a small family, because you're on your own. And then you realize the importance of networks and relationships. And one thing I will tell you guys, I am so blessed to have had the experience of building a business in the United States. Now, building a business in New York City, again, if you want to choose the worst place in your life to go and set up shop when you have no idea what you're doing, choose New York City, for crying out loud. I mean, I could go to Kansas City and I could have made a success in a Dorpy. I went to flipping New York City thinking we're going to build a business. I mean, let me tell you, yes, but I learned everything I know about business from New Yorkers and Americans. And I haven't been diddled. We've never not been paid. I cannot even tell you the luxury of being able to run a business where the ethics was generally outstanding. The work ethic of the team that I've hired over the years has been amazing. And Americans work hard, eh? There's no shortage of willingness amongst the people to get out and do something. So I think that, again, just to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think the early days It was just exhaustion from desperation because you just want so badly to make something work. And so the dark days are thinking you might not succeed. But I'm the eternal optimist. So I used to wake up every day at 6 o'clock and say, listen, but this is going to work today. And you just make every day work, and you just make sure that you treat everybody right. Because if you treat everybody right on the day of the action, you never worry going forwards because you will always have those people standing behind you. So the thing that has kept us alive in this tariff-ridden world has been suppliers who've given us unbelievable credit, also partly desperately in South Africa, and partners in the States that have also given us support, because people that you've known for 35 years would like to see you continue. So you find out of the woodwork friendships and partnerships that you can't count in blessing terms, that are there to help you when it's not a good time. And that's about the ethics of relationships completely. Kobus, I wanted to say one quick thing about coffee. I'm an espresso nut. I don't drink anything that's not outstanding in coffee terms. But I wanted to say that the lovely parallel between coffee and wine is coffee's got even more flavor components on the flavor wheel than wine does. And they two are so parallel. I only drink espresso, so I can taste through wherever there's either a bad washing station or somebody's roasted badly or the machine's not clean or the barista didn't know what they were doing. So I love the analogy and the parallels between the wine and the coffee trade. And I think that you hit the nail on the head. They both are very close bedfellows.
And they're not in competition. They're actually complementary to each other. If you take the whole process of a meal, and sorry for barging in, but just what Andre said about the finance problems, it's so true. The first franchisee that approached us to franchise, which I thought you were speaking Greek, and I said to her, what is franchising? She says, no, I would like the same as this. I said, well, how do we do that? No, whatever you do, I want a store like this. And then she went to the bank and she had about half the money. And she said she's struggling. The bank turns down the loan 3, 4, 5 times. And eventually, typical Ford, I said, give me the bloody bank manager's number. And I phoned the Oak Direct. I said, what is the problem? And I will never forget his words. And my dad actually said the same. So how many cups of coffee do you have to sell to pay back this loan? So I said to him, it's not coffee, it's food, and it's all this. And I was irritated with him that somebody could be that stupid not seeing what I'm seeing. And I wasn't sure what I was seeing anyway. So yes, you're absolutely right. And isn't it funny in life? But that's a cynical part of the human being, I think, is that people will give you 1,000 reasons like that why things cannot work, but had to think about, okay, why will it work? No, I want to think about why it can work, which is a pity. And isn't it more about mindset and attitude? And that's what life's about, really, in business and sport and everything. That's what it taught me, is it's all about attitude. Attitude's everything. I always not tell the story, but I was told this. I said, if you have to employ somebody and we give you only there's 2 criteria that you have to use. One is skills and one is attitude, but you have to pick between them. I, hands down, will pick attitude all the time. But then Dr. Ristron, the very famous doctor in South Africa, he said to me, Kobus, that's true. But if you go for open heart surgery, would you like a moer of a lekker oak to operate you, but he's a useless doctor? Or would you like a real arsehole, but he's got all the skills? So he bowled me actually out. So I give him that one.
No, that's quite right. I'm going to finish off with an interesting story too. But there's a restaurateur, Kobus, in New York. His name is Danny Meyer. He built Union Square Cafe and then the Union Square Restaurant Group, and he's written books on service.
I've read about him. Yeah,
amazing guy. And one of his restaurants, we used to do some really nice business with them. And one of his restaurants, because basically what we did is we sat with sommeliers who knew very little about the category. And I must tell you one funny anecdote about that too. But Danny one day said to me when I was tasting an espresso, and it was in the finest little espresso cup, and it was the most fantastic coffee. And I made some comment, and he said, but Andre, seriously, why would anybody in their right minds who's toiled and struggled to make a restaurant work send somebody home with anything less than magnificence at the end of the meal? So if I put all this effort into everybody and the training of my staff and the rump that I'm getting, and then I scrimp on the coffee, I've just jettisoned the whole thing. And I never forgot that. And then I realized that there's a simple, I've talked about this for 20 years, I've never done it, but I said I'd like to write a restaurant review that reviews two things in a restaurant. If you sit down to a mesclun salad, let's call it a mixed leaf salad, and the dressing is sublime, and the leaves are just extraordinarily crisp, and it's amazing. And then you end up having an espresso, which just blows your mind. What do you think? The rump is going to be lousy, or the lobster is going to be fraught, or no? If you get those two things right, I can guarantee you that everything else in between is going to be outstanding. And so coffee is a phenomenal definer of that experience of a day.
Yeah, that's such valuable lessons you guys already given us. First of all, the humility, the story of Chateau Margaux that I've had the privilege to do a tasting with the cellar master once. It's exceptional. You say it's just getting everything right. If you go through the effort of struggling a year to get the perfect grape into the bottles to make someone taste it, it might as well be good. And the humility and the ability to do the simple things, and then the attitude you bring with it. At Quibus, this is probably more directed of you, because you must have worked with fantastic coaches and fantastic players around you as well. What are the biggest lessons you pulled from your rugby days into your business and still do today?
I think for starters, what you put into it is what you get out of it. Nothing more, nothing less. It's as simple as that. If you're not willing to sacrifice, if you're not willing to learn, it's amazing. And you can win the Super Series, you can win the Currie Cup, you can win the World Cup if you are lucky. But the next morning when you wake up, you're back to square one. That's yesterday's news. And how you carry on from there, I believe, is vitally important. And it's great to be tapped on the shoulder, and we all love to be acknowledged, and rightfully so. If you put in the hard work and the hard yards, whether it's sport, wine, coffee, it doesn't matter, business. We all work hard. We all want to be best that we can be at all levels. We all make mistakes as long as we learn from them. But I think what you put into it is what you get out of it. It's very, very simple. And there's many highs and lows. I think as long as you don't dwell on the lows too long, learn from it. Take it on the chin, and then get up the next morning and try and better that, not make that same mistake. I believe, unfortunately, sometimes in life, certain individuals dwell on the negative and the past more than on the positive, and that's toxic. I think that holds you back. I think that doesn't allow you to shake it off and carry on. Never forget, but don't live that moment. It's not worth it. Use the positive stuff as a motivational factor to be better and better all the time, and as a barometer on yourself. I think the second thing is to be brutally honest with yourself at all times. When you can bullshit anybody, it's not that difficult. But when you stand in front of that mirror and you look at that guy that you know who that guy is, and you're honest with that guy or that girl, that's the most important thing, I think, in life on all levels. Always be honest with yourself. And I think the third one is I think one should acknowledge that that's why they call it team sports. You rely on the guys next to you, in front of you, at the back of you, the coaches. You mentioned the coaches. I regard your dad will acknowledge me in this. Professor Mani Sparmer was one of the most exceptional coaches I've ever played under. Unbelievable coach, bright, reads the game incredible. And then, of course, a guy like Kitch Christie goes without saying, unbelievable coach for different reasons. And a guy like Andre Markgraaf, which is so passionate about the game. And when he was the Bok coach, we were highly successful. Unbelievable. I thought that group of players just after the Kitch Christie era with Andre Markgraaf was in the same road. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we went to RG and to France and to Wales, and we came back unbeaten, and we had a brilliant side. So I would like to think those guys, I would give them all the credit for shaping the players, and myself inclusive, and the players that I played with and against. I think without players and teammates and opponents is very, very important. I mean, they make you a better player. That's why to this day, with all the accolades and all the trophies and all the pick the best team and who's the best wicketkeeper, I think that's all bullshit. I think it's unrealistic. To me, there's only one prize that a player should be given, and that's the Player's Player of the Year. It's the most honest, it's the most unattached, it's the most no reason for an opponent to give you, his opponent, an accolade. It's honest. It's to the bone. There's nothing attached to it. They don't get anything to say. And if you can acknowledge your opponent when he's playing well, that's honest.
That's awesome, Cobus. And it's amazing. Like I've always said that for me, business is also a team sport. Because it's if you're not doing it with somebody else, you end up in this lonely position. But it also obviously creates challenges. And you, Andre, if you look back, I mean, you were an athlete as well, growing up and rowing. And what was some of the lessons you took from that into business and then this concept of starting in a new country with no network? How did those things play in your mind?
So the other day I went to my old school, to King Edward's, where I rowed for the South African junior squad in '79. I have to say that I'm sure you guys are familiar. Rowing competitively is one of the most grueling physical commitments you could make in any sport. And so, firstly, I think you have to be committed. I mean, you really have to be committed. You can't pretend. Secondly, you have to be consistent. You've got to show up when you might not want to show up. You've got to do that every day. And then you have to, in context, you've got to inspire. If in any way, shape, or form you're blessed with a leadership position, your job is to lead by example. And Cobus made that point early on. We've never shied away, my wife nor I, in our businesses, of doing anything and everything needed, from cleaning the toilets down to hosting somebody at a chairman's meeting. It makes no difference. We've been agnostic about what you do. It's the attitude that you adopt. And I think in the team spirit, I said to the young crew that I was sat down with about a month or two ago in Joburg, the first 8 at King Edward's, and I said, at the end of the day, it is truly about the connectedness between all of you, that you have to have each other's backs, and you have to work so closely together, because if you don't, you're never going to win a race. You have to truly believe in each other, and you have to actually step outside of the bounds of comfort to support each other authentically. And I feel the same and also leading in sport. I found the same thing. You've got to inspire. You can't instruct. You have to live it, and you have to live the authenticity of what you do. And you have to be somebody that others can follow authentically, not like I'm telling you what to do. I want to show you how I think it can be done. And that example, that physical example, I think is incredibly powerful. Something else Cobus said too that's fundamental is, if you live with the negativity of all your wounds and histories and scars over the time, you then bring the world down around you. You've got to use those historic moments as learning curves. They can frame your better decision-making going forwards, but you have to always live with the hope that what you are doing today is potentially going to make a difference. You've got to be able to use today's trajectory well. I say to people, the world is full of the word mindfulness, but if you can be truly mindful, like as in this conversation, that we are all currently present in this conversation, all of us, and being present is sort of that gift. The present is not a joke. You cannot think outside of the present in a business. You've got a plan, you've got to write your 5-year projections and 3-year projections, all of which are going to be bullshit, by the way, excuse my French. You should always halve your projections and double your costs as an entrepreneur, because you think it's going to be 5 times more sales and 3 times less money. So I think it's about that consistency. It's the grit and the fierce, but it's authentically leading from the heart. You have to help people believe in themselves. And you have to every day show up with the attitude that you can do. Otherwise, the world's a rough place, so you get eaten up quickly. But people respect that, and people resonate with that. And my point is with endurance, which is clearly a rowing piece. Oh, and I said this to the young team. I said, I will hire somebody if they come to me with a professional rowing experience on their CV. And they were like, wow, really? So as I was leaving that afternoon, one of the guys ran up and said, Sir, can I ask you something? And I said, sure. He said, listen, if I come and ask you for a job, would you hire me? And I said, yes. So I won't be surprised if I get a call, but I would hire somebody like that. I'd hire somebody who's played professional rugby, because you've been through the mix. You've done the hard work. You're not afraid of doing that. And I think that's part of selecting a team, is trying to figure out who's going to be with you in that scrum, in that push, in that slog. and it's going to have your back. Those are the people that you want on your team.
Just to add to that, I think I don't really much believe in CVs because I've never seen a shitty one these days. Everybody is just incredible, but they're out of job. So, I mean, it's just, sorry, again, tongue in cheek. But what you say, Andre, is so true. And I'm not knocking individual sports. I'm not knocking the tennis player or the golfer. A great respect for any God-given talent and hard work, and I honestly mean that. But you guys know that team sport, team environment is very different. It's a matter of sacrifice before you can take. You've got to give before you can receive. The team is always bigger. And I believe you are born a team player or you're not. And if you have to teach somebody to be part of a team and how to fit in, it's difficult if you're not a natural team player. And I do the same as you, Andre. I look at this and I always ask Oaks, did you do any sport? Have you done any sport? Are you doing any sport? Any sport. I don't care. What is that? Is it a team sport? And Oak said, no, I was the Boentjie Spoeg champion at the Pits of Water or whatever. Not really fit into the team. But like you've just said now, the team, if somebody that fits into a team and is willing to work hard in the team environment to the benefit of the team, that's the person you want because they normally can function under pressure.
That's very true. I've never rowed, Andre, but while I attended Cambridge, I tried to get into the team, and we had to go through trials, and doing trials, you had to row a 2K under 6 minutes, and I didn't even get close. I was like 6:17 or something, and it was the worst thing. I backed myself. I've done some horrible rugby fitness, and but that was I couldn't believe how tough it was. But we had the opportunity to be taught by Mark Durant, who's an ethnograph professor at Cambridge, and he went to live with the Blues rowing team, which is the highest. It's like even higher than Olympics to make those teams almost. And he came up with a simple phrase to describe that, and it relates perfectly to what you guys just have been said. It's not about the best 8; it's the 8 best. You can't just even if you're in a business, you pick CVs and you think, okay, now I've got the 10 best CVs. This business must work. It's never going to work. It's going to last. You have to pick the right guys. You have to pick. When we see the teams, the best teams I've played in, it's not always the guys with the best CVs on the teams that win. Quibus, in your days as well, that 95 team wasn't necessarily the best players that actually won it, but it was the best team. Yes, it was a great team.
It's that old cliche when they say it's not about the size of the dog in the fight, but it's the size of the fight in the dog that brings the cups. Simple.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go full circle. Andre, why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about the Indaba Foundation and how you got into early childhood development and what's your dream of what can happen there?
Thank you, Justinus. So, starting the wine business was when actually the seeds of this foundation were sown, and I didn't realize it at the time, but we all know we live in one of the most beautiful, by far, parts of the world, and we have some of the most amazing people on the planet, to be honest. But we're dealing with a swamp of human indignity. And so I started recognizing early on in my wine industry space, my brother and I, Gary, we'd drive around the wine industry watching parents, drunk parents with kids in tow all over the Western Cape. And it was something that you became almost anesthetized to because it was something quite difficult to grasp, but you would see it all the time and you'd realize, how is this possible? And when I used to raise the topic to the industry players at the time, I was told it's legacy. We just have a legacy. And I was like, well, okay, we have a legacy. What do we do with a legacy? Does it mean that you have to continue with that legacy, or how do you change the legacy? And then a lot of the alcohol industry players have been forced by government to put up billboards and spend hundreds of millions of rands of money on anti-alcohol advertising. People drown their souls and sorrows when they're traumatized. And we live in one of the most traumatized countries in the world. And our children and women are literally mostly all traumatized by our origins and by the society that we have created for them to be living in. So over the years, my wife and I got involved here locally when our youngest son was 3, going into a school. And he ended up in a Montessori school. And that was the start of my journey of understanding how vital the early years education was, because I got quite involved in an altercation between 2 members of staff. They were arguing about quality standards and training. And after this debate and the introspection I had and the conversations I had with other training and people from the educational world, my whole mindset around who we are as humans changed, literally. And I started to understand with alarming clarity that the early years of life, if they are not handled properly, and if you have any form of trauma in your first 6 years of life, which sadly is the bulk of humanity, that trauma is often baked into your neurological development, and it often impedes the development of the brain and leaves a lasting residue that you carry through your life. So we started bringing Montessori training from Amsterdam. It's the Association Montessori International, which is the world's leading Montessori platform. But it was very expensive. So I started a foundation in the US principally, and the principle was to bring training to South Africa of a world-class method that ultimately would change the quality of our early years education system. So we trained the diploma folks first. We trained about 150 odd teachers. And then 2017, working with a woman in India, Uma Ramani, who was a Montessori global trainer, we built, with her original model, we built a program called Community Rooted Education. And we started doing pilots just at the pandemic or just after, in training women in Kayamandi Township in Stellenbosch, in this extraordinary 12-month program, which really is a transformational approach to framing a woman who often comes from deep trauma, who's been literally is unseen by society. So we started this training in some of the most destitute communities, and this program has started to yield metrics and results. The one in particular is called the Early Learning Outcome Measure, that is a government metric developed by LEGO and UNICEF and the government in 2019. The children that we've measured that are from the centers and the women that we've trained have the highest ELOMs almost in the country, which is literacy and numeracy, executive functioning, fine and gross motor skills. And these are measurements at 4 and 5 years old. So the children in our system have a 92% average on the 5 metrics. The country's average is 46, and 80% of our 4th graders cannot read for meaning. Now, if any human being with half a brain thinks you're going to build an economy on that, I can tell you right now, you're not. And what we're witnessing in unemployability is just an outcome of that scourge that struck us for decades, and it's coming back to bite us now. And unless we take care of the transformation of the lower reaches of the education sector, we will never, never build an enabled workforce that is able to grow the GDP of the country to the point that we can actually sustain the population. So over the past 3, 4, 5 years and more, I've started speaking on this, been raising money. The Walton family from Walmart has been an amazing asset to us. And I was advising the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority last year for some time. I'm speaking this year in Doha at the Qatar Foundation's WISE Forum, and we are literally in the wine industry's footprint. We're actually starting a core program in Argentina with the World Bank. We're starting a program, I hope, next year in California, embedding our community-rooted education in the worker, migrant labor community of California. Why are we doing that? Because we're showcasing what we built in South Africa. And we're realizing that what we built in South Africa is transformational anywhere. It is not about the country or the community or the creed or the culture. It's about how to empower a woman to be the most nurturing and pedagogically fine-tuned person, irrespective of their background. And so we've trained about 500 women now with impact about 20,000 kids. And the outcomes are literally world-class in a petri dish of inhumanity. And so we're starting to see this expand. We believe that over the next 5 years, we can impact literally millions of kids. And my worldview is I need a strong wine business. Next year, we're launching a new brand called The Educator. It's a brand dedicated entirely to the woman educator in the world. And I'm doing a California Chardonnay, an Argentinian Malbec, and New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Why? Because those are amongst the most sold varietals and products in the world, in the wines world. And our goal is to build a 1 million case brand globally that funds in perpetuity much of the work that we're doing in the various wine regions of the world, focusing on South Africa as the hub. And so I like to think that we have independently, without any government intervention, we have laid the foundations, what I believe will be the largest social transformation in South Africa's history, is to reframe the early years system and to bring about a transformation, not only with entrepreneurship of the woman in question, but the woman and the kids that they nurture, bearing in mind that we live in a country where family structure has been shredded by the present. We deal with a mostly single mother family system. And how do you raise and parent children when you're a single mom with 4 kids in a township trying to bloody survive? It's very difficult to parent. So our job is to help that these mothers have surrogate partners in raising kids and family by building this network. And I want to tell you that I had Isak Justinus on Tuesday in Kaimandi, and we met a woman in the middle of her training. And I listened to her speak, and I want to tell you, I was humbled to the point of being ashamed that I had found certain things difficult in my life. And I listened to this compassionate, outspoken, mindful woman living in abject poverty. And I went into her classroom with 35 little children. And she described to me how her training with Indaba has allowed her to take children with such heavy spectrum disorder and autism and normalize them. And there was this calm, loving environment with these children that then I thought, okay, you know what? Then until I'm dead, this is it, boys. You're going to have to shunt me out in the wheelbarrow, but I'm not stopping to work. I'm not retiring. So, I'm trying to also use the wine world also to Clovis's point, I think, and Flip, you've mentioned it too. Wine is a great integrator, and it's a great platform to share stories and to raise money. So I'm trying to integrate our wine business with our philanthropic ideals and building an early childhood transformational platform for women. And we're also going to train Montessori nannies in South Africa and the Middle East. So that's the round 2 about to unfold. But yeah, sorry for the long story, but that's the story.
That's amazing, Andre, and thanks for sharing. I think it's good to know it's more than just philanthropic. It's actually you're understanding why before why you're doing it, and I think it's a lot of South Africans, and the South Africans we come across in our lives and our daily. They want to give back, they don't know where or how they need to get back, and it's good to understand the why, and that's why it's so important to do this, to do the work you're doing.
Cobus.
Yeah, I think it's what Andre said is crucially important. It's part of being responsibility of, if you regard yourself as a decent human being, and you're blessed, like we all are, to give back in any form, and whatever ticks and floats your boat. I think it's our duty to make a difference, not just be oxygen users, but give something back. And we as a brand and personally, it's strange how life works. Not strange, it's amazing, actually. Our son was born 2 months prem, and he was in ICU, and it was touch and go, and it was, as you can imagine, it was a tough time. And a girl that now works for us kept on saying to me, I want to introduce you, and I want to take you to this school because I want you to get involved in this school. And the school is called the Forest Town School in Joburg, which is for cerebral palsy children. And I kept on ashamedly saying, yeah, no, I'll do it. Don't worry. And hoping she'll go away. And I say this with absolute disgust to myself. But anyway, and then Leroux was born, and it was this drama, and it was literally between life and death and so forth. You wouldn't say it now because he's eating us out of the house anyway. So there's nothing wrong with him, thank God. And then I went to this Forest Town School, and from that day onwards, I've been very blessed and fortunate to be their patron. And as I say, it's for Forest Town. Forest Town is for cerebral palsy kids, and what they do, they bring them from Soweto, from all over Gauteng, to the school where they evaluate all these children, And with all the, if you know cerebral palsy, it's a various stages of capabilities, meaning mentally, cognitively, and the motor skills. Some of them can do a lot of things, and some can do very little, but they then focus on that very strength of theirs and try and teach them a skill so they can be they can have dignity, and they can feel they can make a contribution, whatever that might be. We've also they've established a little coffee shop there where they bake bread every day, and we've trained their baristas, and the community comes in and they buy their bread, and it's wonderful. But anyway, so we've been involved in that for a long time. We do golf days for them, and we try and give and contribute a small thing to the dignity of those people. And just imagine you're a kid in Soweto, and you've got cerebral palsy, and your mum and dad both work, and they get up at 4 a.m, and 5 they hit the taxi to Joburg Central. So they lock them physically up, and when they come back tonight at 9, they open that shack again, and there's that little kid sitting, which is crazy. It's crazy. So we little things like we were able to use our rugby contacts to get somebody like Toyota to sponsor 4 minibuses, so they get now driven from Soweto to the school and back. They get a decent meal, they're in the environment, and their parents can work and try and help. So it's an institute that's really close to my heart, and I think it's really necessary that people like this, it's our duty to support them. The other one we'd be involved in is a body called SAI, which Dr. Theo de Jager is heading it up, and it's a body that he's also the World Farmers Association president, and he's the only guy in history, which makes him a remarkable individual, that only guy in history that's been re-elected back-to-back as world president. So he does a proper job. And what they do, SAI, is they're very family-orientated. So SAI is a body that supports the family farmer and the farm worker in South Africa. Andre won't have anything to brag about in New York and the rest of the states, wine-wise, if there wasn't a farmer and the workers on the farm. We can't feed the nation. In general, we can't sell food in our stores and give them proper coffee if it wasn't for the farmer around the world and more in our country. So no farmer, no food to any nation. It's a no-brainer, really. And every cup of coffee we sell, we donate money to SAI, which look after drought areas, the safety of the farmer and his workers on the farms, give them drought relief, help them. Our first project, by the way, I mentioned in Professor Mani Spalmer, who's a guy that grew up in the Laingsburg area. And if you know Laingsburg, you know it's godforsaken country, if there ever is a country like that. But and they put up night vision cameras in a region called the Moordenaarsvlakte, which is in the middle of nowhere, because the Oaks had huge problems there with sheep theft and stuff like that. And in the first week, and the police wasn't really interested in helping the guy. So in the first week, they caught 11 sheep thieves in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden, everybody, and the police included, said, "Oh well, this is working. How can we assist?" I feel very proud, in a small way, that every customer that comes to Wiesenhof or comes to Cafe Dolce and drinks a cup of coffee contributes to something like that to help the family farmer and the farm worker to be safe and to be able to do what they do best, and that's to provide a product for the nation, because we all have to eat. So those are the main things that we're involved in, and it's amazing how people, like Flipper said, most people out there, which is most good-hearted people, and which is the majority of the population, wants to contribute, but not sure where do you start. And let's be honest, guys, there's lots of scammers out there as well. But they know drinking a cup of coffee and drinking more than one cup of coffee, I contribute to that oak, to being able to put food on my plate for him and his people on his farm and his family to be safe and to be able to do what they do best, and that's to provide.
Thanks, Kobus. Thanks for sharing. That's amazing. So last question from our side, and then you guys can each ask each other one question. And it's so much of what you said there, Kobus, as well. And Andre, I think back to that first breakfast or coffee, or I can't remember what it was, you and I had in Stellenbosch. And one of the ideas we shared is this this idea of this personal revelation that we go through, and then we see the world in a different way, and it's very hard to go back and see the way, even imagine how you saw the world before. So the last question we have is around what is needed to really build a country that works for everybody. And that's something I've really been reflecting on for a long time. And I would love to hear both of your views. What is it really going to take for us to build a country that works for everybody? Andre, you want to take it first?
So, you and I spoke that day about once you see, you cannot unsee. And I think most who know me will go, oh, yes, starting on the early childhood thing again, because literally we are sadly too far down the roadway to rehabilitate everybody where we are. It's not going to be possible. You cannot band-aid logistically or financially a society forever. A society often implodes and has to be reborn like a phoenix rising from the ashes. You cannot simply put a few band-aids on broken bits and pieces all along. It is going to break more and more and more until you get disintegration. Less than 1% of the total education budget goes towards early childhood. Less than 1%. It is never going to allow the country to actually revive itself and in 20 years' time have a workforce worthy and able enough to carry on its shoulders the country's future. So I think we as a country, our resurrection and our transformation cannot be done unless we place that early years and the priority of women and women's transformation at the front of the agenda.
Kobus, you like entrepreneurship. What do you think? How do we build a country that works for everybody?
First, by starting with honest government. It's simple. It's the base. The leader should show what is the right ethical way to live, to run a country. The corruption in South Africa is doing more damage than anything, in my opinion, unfortunately, sadly. People not really working for the people, but working for themselves, trying to reach themselves is really tragic and sad. But saying all of that, and it sounds extremely glooming and dooming, and it is, I still really believe that 90% of the people in this country are good-hearted people, honest people, ethical people, and I will die by that. I see that every day walking around. People are just good people who are fed up with poor government, but the wheel's turning. I think time's running out for people who don't serve the people, and honest governance, and I'll leave it at that. But I think, like I said earlier, I think entrepreneurs on all levels, because entrepreneurs also teach other people, empowers them to empower their kids, and so it goes on. It also teaches mindset and attitude and all those kind of things. I think is very, very important. But also, I would like to just mention a third one, and that's proper parenting. We need parents with backbone, with ethics and morals, and we need to go back to basics, guys. If you want to get my Rev motor up, and my kids and the millennials, they quickly to say, yeah, but you must remember times have changed. That's bullshit. Good manners, discipline, honest hard work has never changed, will ever change. That's the fundamentals of life. The look of cars and clothes and fashion come and go, but those things never go. If you have those and your kids know that and they can teach their kids, it's as simple as that. There's no way around that. We need to go back to basics.
And if I can just add on that, Kobus, about the entrepreneurship very quickly, I think that what people also fail to grasp is that these women that nobody notices or sees who run a shack with 35 kids in them are purely entrepreneurial. They have no support from anybody. They make ends meet with whatever their actions on that day are. So what I say to people is, when you resource that individual, you've got 35 of them in a group learning together. That power of those 35 and then those 350 and then those 3,500 is entrepreneurial, like to the power of 10, because each of those women impact the families they serve as well. So we witness this as an incredibly powerful ecosystem of expansion based actually principally on entrepreneurship.
That's amazing insights. Thanks, guys. We have a little tradition on the show we will allow our guests to ask each other a question. You can decide who goes first. HP4 Beauty.
I've got not really a question, Andre. I've just got a statement. I'll send you coffee if you send me wine.
Listen, done. Absolutely done. What a pleasure. Actually, I really mean that, Clovis. I'd love to. You give me your address. I think that's a very, very fair trade. Then let me ask you one question: is knowing everything that you know, what is something that you still would really love to achieve in the next chapter of your life?
I would like to play the violin.
Wow. Oh, amazing.
Pretty ambitious. Wow.
For the simple reason, I'm a huge classical fan. I had piano lessons at school. I sang in the choir. I think some of the most genius people in the history of mankind thus far, and there were many people. The Mozarts, the Beethovens, the Tchaikovskys of the world were absolute God-given, born geniuses. For the simple reason, you even if you hate classical music, you have to acknowledge if you can write a symphony at the age of 8 years old, there's something special. That is genius. That's the one point. Secondly, for hundreds of years, that music is just becoming more and more popular. Some music come and go, but these people had no computers, nothing. It's God-given talent. They had the ability to listen and create and these things. And I've always had this incredible respect and interest in these special human beings that could do something like that, which is really amazing. And I've always been told, coming to the violin with a long rounded story, is that it's one of the most difficult instruments ever to master is a violin. And it's a beautiful sound. I mean, let's be honest, it could be one of the saddest sounds you hear as a violin, but also one of the most incredible sounds that brings people to a standstill, to listen, to acknowledge, to appreciate is a violin. So watch the space, boys. I'm gonna play the violin soon.
I love it. Love it.
Wow. I'm looking forward to the TikTok clip of you playing the violin.
Drinking a glass of Cabernet that I sent you.
Talking about that, you guys remember the Samoan captain Peter Fatialofa, who played tight head prop. He was a great classical guy. His famous quote is this: he compared rugby to classical music, and they say, where the hell do you draw the line? He says, well, you must understand that the backs might be the oaks who play the piano, but the forwards move the piano.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much, Guy. That's it for this episode of Winning the Away Game. You'll find us on YouTube or wherever you get your high-quality podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn or Instagram and tell us who would you like us to out next. I'm Justinus Adriaanse.
And I'm Flip van der Merwe. Thank you very much for listening.